Welcome back. Now let's look at the second phase of grief, which is the receptive phase. Now, often this feels like kind of coming out of the fog a little bit, like the heavy, dense fog of despair is just starting to break up a little bit. Now, it's still extremely difficult to see. It's still a phase with intense, high, strong emotions. But even though you can't see the specific path forward, you're starting to glimpse that there is a path there. And this is when you then start to look for answers. You start to look for new meanings with life and try to find ways to cope. Now, often this phase is initiated, or it feels like it's initiated by some kind of shift. Now, this can be for the person grieving, it often can be an internal shift, but it can also be something external that it's like a light bulb goes off, something that initiates this realization that life is still going on and life doesn't pause for anyone. Now, from an outside perspective, it can be subtle changes in behavior, or it can be a subtle willingness to start talking. For me, this shift felt like it came all of a sudden, although it was a gradual progression. See, the thing that happened to me was that I suddenly realized that my daughter, who was only 3.5 at the time, was asking me, "Are you okay, Mama?" Mama is the Norwegian word for mummy. And even though I'd heard her say this so many times, and I'd noticed it, I'd been answering her, acknowledging her, it was only at that point, at that moment, that it dawned on me that she was asking me this about 50 times a day. And it was as if somebody just smacked me upside the head, because even though I'd been answering her and acknowledging her the entire time, it was only in that moment I realized the severity of it. And that quickly woke me up, because it was not her job to be looking out for me. It's not the job of a 3-year-old to be worried and protective of their mom. So I knew I had to make a change. But like I said, the shift, it can be a big shift, it can be a small, subtle shift, but typically something happens. There's a change in behavior, there's a change in the way you speak, even just starting to speak at all, which can signal that the person is starting to become receptive to outside inputs. They're starting to become receptive to the fact that they have to keep on living. This is a time where many will start to talk. This is a time where it can be very beneficial and helpful to join groups, support groups. We're starting to open up to your loved ones. As a supporter, this is a good time to really show that you're there and that you are ready to listen. Now, as I said, this phase is still a very emotional phase, and it's really a roller coaster. Now, I think that one of the best ways to describe this phase is that it's like living 2 parallel lives, or a life of 2 parallel paths. On the one side, you are now noticing that you have to keep on living. So you do it in the way that you know how, which is by going back to the life that you had before. Going back to your job, going back to the same meetings, going back to school, going back to hanging out with your friends. Everything that was in your life before the incident or the loss. Now, in this path, you'd want to fit in. And in order to fit into your old life, you have to be your old self. That means that you have to be okay, even though you're not. So on the other hand, you have a different path. Now, this is a new path that you don't know what it looks like. You don't know how to deal with it, or how to live it, or how to incorporate it. So it's very private, because it feels like nobody understands it. This is where your grief lives. This is where you can feel your emotions and where you can talk and think and feel everything that's going on. Now, the challenge is that while everybody who knows you knew you in the old life on this past path, you also love them and you want to please them. You want to fit in with them. And you don't want to drag them down with you. Now, living a life on two parallel paths is extremely exhausting. On the one side, where you're trying to live again, you're having to put on a mask. It's like putting on a costume, the costume of your old self. A costume that no longer fits. But you do your best. So before you go out, before you interact with anyone, you have to mentally prepare. What am I going to say? What am I going to answer? I know they're going to ask me how I'm doing. Should I be honest? Can I say how I am? Or will that ruin the party for everyone else? Or should I just say that I'm okay? Put a lid on it and pretend. At the same time, just fitting in to the same old conversations, topics that at the moment seem pointless to you. It's also extremely tiring. It's hard to join in conversations that seem so futile, so unimportant, because often when we're in grief, it's accompanied by a big perspective shift. Things that seemed big before now seem tiny. But that's your perspective shift, not everybody else's. So while you now look at these old problems as tiny, everybody else still looks at them as the same big problems. And it's hard to fit in. It's hard to join in on these conversations when you're no longer at the same level. So it demands a lot of mental power to constantly think of how to act and how to be. Constantly minding your words. Constantly weighing whether or not you can be honest. Always thinking out the scenarios. If I say this, how is this person going to react? And then what are they going to ask? If I answer this question this way, what's going to be the follow-up question? All these thoughts go through your mind. I vividly remember that even going to the grocery store was extremely tiring. And I would come home with a throbbing headache because I had to mentally prepare for what would happen if I ran into somebody I knew. But then on the other path, the new path, it can feel very alone, very isolating. This is where the true you now probably lives. But very few can understand it. There's very few to share it with. So the receptive phase is a very challenging emotional phase. In some ways, it's even more so than the despair phase because this is such a roller coaster. And it's often filled with a lot of internal struggles and guilt. Because like I said, all these social interactions you're now trying to have, you're showing yourself as being happy and glad to please others and to try and enjoy the situation yourself. But most likely, every smile is also followed by a feeling of guilt because everything is still so raw and emotions are still so strong that whenever you do put them aside, it's very normal to feel guilty about doing so. In this phase, it can be extremely challenging to interact with others. And social anxiety is quite common. It comes from the feeling of not fitting in any longer, trying to go back to your old life and not fitting in. And it creates a gap between the grieving person and everyone else because you no longer know how to talk to them. Very important in this phase that as a supporter, you focus on listening. validate the range of emotions. And most importantly, keep in mind that a smile does not mean they're okay. I remember one particular occasion where I met one of my aunts for the first time after the funeral. It was a couple of months after my daughter had died. And it was the Norwegian national holiday, which is celebrated as the Children's Day in Norway. And I was struggling my very best to keep it together. It was an extremely difficult, tough day. I was watching the kids' parade where my daughter should have been in it. And everywhere I looked, every smile I saw was a reminder that she wasn't there. But I did my best to put on a smile because my other daughter still wanted to and still deserved to enjoy the day. So I put on a smile and I tried my best. And when I bumped into my aunt, she comes over and she hugs me. She goes, "Oh, it's so nice to see you out and so nice to see that you're doing so well and oh, so nice to see you smile." It was like a dagger through my heart. I was not okay. Of course, I know that she meant no harm by it. She genuinely wanted to be kind. But for me, because of the state I was in, it was like I was filled with so much guilt. I wasn't ready to acknowledge that I could have a normal life without constantly grieving my daughter. I wasn't ready to have the world think that I was okay, that I was over her. So when my aunt said that, "Oh, it's so nice to see you doing so well," I felt so tremendously guilty about it. So please remember, a smile does not mean that you're okay. But at the same time, it's also okay to not be okay. And then sometimes it's okay to take your emotions and put them aside and take a break. So when you're supporting someone who's going through a tough time, if they're able to take a break from their emotions and enjoy a moment and let them do so, and you can subtly show them that you understand that that does not mean they're okay, but it's okay in this moment. Now, head on over into the workbook and complete the activities for this lesson, and I will see you in the next one.